I'm going to talk a little bit in this video about scientific writing, writing a scientific report. And this is an overview and a formula for writing scientific papers and reports that can be expanded on, but it tends to be pretty effective when you're writing up results from a field project that you've done. A lot of this is captured in this reading on collecting, analyzing, and reporting ecological data. And there's a whole section of this chapter that is about scientific report writing. And it's right near the end, writing a research report. And so this is a great reference to use when putting things together and looking for the details of what you need to know in terms of citation, in terms of numbering, in terms of what sorts of abbreviations to use, when to use certain sorts of practices when you're doing scientific writing. Some general rules of thumb is keep the writing very direct, keep it as concise as possible. The goal of scientific writing is to convey specific, accurate information about a research project, and really no more or no less than that. So you tell the story as encompassing a story as you can tell with your research without overstating it and without understating it. And so it's really important. I'm going to draw a formula for writing a paper. And it's pretty specific, but as I've mentioned, you can expand on it. So I like to think of a scientific report or a research paper as an hourglass. And that is literally, and an hourglass goes from broad to narrow, right, at both ends. And that really, quite literally, is what a scientific paper does. It starts by grounding the work of the authors in the broader literature of what we already know about some topic. What do we know about these larger ideas and theories in ecology or whatever your field is? And then it narrows. It narrows to specific systems, often in ecology, what we know about certain systems or certain groups of organisms, and then narrows down further to a specific research question. Okay, and so once you get to the point of addressing a research question and posing a hypothesis, you're in the details, in the very narrow details of a study. The study is representing, testing questions that fit into a larger field, but the studies themselves are usually fairly narrow. And so the methods and materials section of a research paper happens right here at the narrowest part of the hourglass. And so we have an introduction here. We go from broad to narrow in our introduction. We narrow right down into our methods, specific methods, and our results. And then we broaden back out as we discuss and place our results back into context. And so that is a scientific paper. And so here's my formula. So I'm going to write introduction here. Methods here. Results here. And discussion. Maybe I should start discussion here. Okay, so that is the general outline. And I recommend a 3-3-3-3 paragraph strategy if you're at a loss for how to structure things. You can always expand it if needed, but it's a useful practice to try and do. And so in an introduction, now this is not including the abstract. I'll talk about the abstract at the end. I'm going to make a note to do that. Okay, so we'll have abstract over here. In your introduction, you start as big as possible. And often when people are studying birds, say they're studying a red-winged blackbird, and they're looking at some kind of behavior that's associated with their plumage or some other question about their ecology, the tendency for people new to scientific writing would be to start to talk about red-winged blackbirds and their importance in the environment. But really, it's important to broaden out, even broader. If you're talking about plumage and signaling, it might be about visual communication in birds. That might be your bigger topic. Or you might be talking about sexual selection, types of sexual selection. And so broadening out to the broadest idea that encompasses what you're doing often goes well beyond your organism and actually deals with questions that go into a much broader realm in the field of ecology or behavior. So you start broad, okay? Broad. The broad framing of your concept, okay? And this can draw from papers. So you're rooting what you're doing into the literature that's already been published in the field. And so you're rooting this in papers that may be from all over the world and may focus on lots of different variety of organisms. Okay, so this is the broad framing. Okay, so that's paragraph 1. Paragraph 2 is a bit narrower. Okay, so this might be your system. If I stick with something like red-winged blackbirds, we might talk about the habitat gradient that exists in that system from the marsh edge to upland areas and the sorts of challenges that a steep habitat gradient might pose for birds and what type of breeding system, for example, that might favor. And so you're getting narrower. You're going from a broader concept to something that's slightly more narrow. It's the system that you're working in. And the system may be a habitat. The system might be a group of organisms. It may be something else, but it's the system that you're going to be operating in and doing your test in. And then the third paragraph is your question. So this is where you may start to talk about, or you might start to talk about your organism in a second, but here, what do we know that about these bigger concepts in our specific system and study, and what do we not know? And then at the end of this, you're posing, what is it that you're trying to answer? What are you trying to address that's new in the field? And at the very end, you'll pose your hypothesis. I'm saying HA and HO, your null and your alternative hypothesis. You will make some predictions at the end of that paragraph. Ask a question and make some predictions. Okay. When you've done that, you've set yourself up really well to start a method section because you've already introduced the reader to the bigger topic and you've narrowed down so the person's ready to learn about the methods that you're going to use. In ecological projects where you're out in the field, it's very common that your first paragraph is your study site or sites. And very typical to describe the study site, provided a name, provide the general description of the region, latitude and longitude as the center point of these study sites. So you may have a table even in your methods if you have several study sites. If it's a reserve, you just put the center point of it. But if you're crossing lots of different areas, you might have several latitude and longitude. You note the elevation in meters, your latitude, your longitude. You provide a description of the habitat. So you describe your study site. The second thing you do is you describe your field methods. In this case, we're talking about field methods. But you're going to describe your methods, regardless of what kinds of methods you're using, you're going to describe them. You can spend one paragraph discussing them quite often. For bird projects, it's often surveys were conducted at dawn until this certain amount of time, this certain amount of survey method was used, or this certain type of survey method was used. And so it depends on the study how you describe it. But you describe these methods well enough so that somebody could look at them and actually replicate the study. They can go to your study site, they can go and do the study at the exact same dates and times of day, and they could use the same methods to see if they could replicate the same results that you did. So you describe those field methods. And then finally, a third paragraph that again, people newer to this type of writing often leave off is the analytical methods. Okay, and so how did you analyze your data? Did you run a t-test? Did you do a correlation analysis, like a regression analysis? Did you do some sort of other analysis? And it's pretty common in these analytical results to talk about the software that you use to run your analysis and some of the assumptions you made about your data, okay? And so this is also where you can reintroduce your hypotheses, your null and your alternative hypothesis, because you have a larger theoretical hypothesis or an idea about the biology of the organism, and then when you get to your analytical methods, you're talking about your statistical hypothesis. So it might be reworded slightly depending on how you frame your study, but it will be, they're both addressing the same issue. Then you get your results, okay? And the results really is this section of the paper that is a reporting out. But sometimes people don't know how to organize it. And I recommend that you also use a 3-paragraph approach. Sometimes you're only using a 2-paragraph approach. It really depends. But I would start, let's just say you use 1 paragraph doing this. You summarize the data. Okay. With bird data, say you're observing multiple species, you can summarize your data with this many person hours were spent in the field. We collected this many observations of this many species and this many individuals. If you're collecting habitat data, which you should for any kind of field project, you can report averages of things like canopy height or ground cover and this sort of thing. So you have a paragraph that's summing up the major points. It doesn't have to be every kind of mean that you would generate in your data set, but in general, what was your sampling like? What was observed, okay? So it can be a short paragraph. Your second paragraph is your results from the hypothesis. So go by hypothesis, okay? By hypothesis, okay? And report your results. And this is where you're going to refer to, there may be tables referred to or figures here, but here you're going to definitely be referring to, like, you're going to generate at least 1 figure, and you're going to report things like p-value, okay, for your tests. Now, if you started off with only 1 question, and it turns out you didn't get a significant p-value, you couldn't reject a null hypothesis. If you have collected the data carefully, there may be some other things that you can look at to explain the data. And that's where you go with a 3rd paragraph. Any sort of details that are relevant to the result. And that's in analytical form. Analysis again, okay. And so, for example, you say you're comparing abundances of birds in 2 habitats. 1 habitat you think will support many more species, so maybe you're looking at species richness, than another. And you may not see that difference in species richness, but you're seeing, say, different associations, different types of species in there, and you think they're associating with different types of habitat. You can then follow up in this 3rd paragraph saying, well, we looked for relationships of some of these birds in the different habitats, and this is what we found, even though we didn't find any differences. If you do find differences, then you may again follow up with, okay, do we have any information from our data set as to what was causing them? So usually there's space for 3 paragraphs there, but it's just a report out. It's not really an interpretation of the results, other than were the results significant in terms of statistically significant or not. And then you have your discussion. Again, people new to this kind of writing may think that this is a rehashing of the results, but it's really not. It's actually, and it's not a rehashing of the introduction either. It is a placing what has happened back into context. And the reason why that is not a rehashing of an introduction is that your study provides new context to what we understand about the field. And so, and you may have learned some new things, made new observations during the course of this study that were unexpected. They get reported in the discussion. And the discussion does go from narrower often to broader. So you're ending with placing it really right back into the context of that big question, okay? And so you usually start with a paragraph where you really are interpreting these results. Okay, and so you're interpreting the significance, you're stating that there were or weren't differences in whatever you were observing. And this is where you may say something about sampling effort. Was it enough? You might be saying something about the variation that you observed. You could say some things. This is often, when we mention this about the scientific writing, people start to insult their own work quite a lot, but it's not meant to do that. It's meant to just say, hey, if we found some significant results, how do we understand them in the context of what we did? Is if there's really not anything that's highly significant, but say you have a very small p-value. Well, are these results then not interesting? What's interesting about them if it seems like they're so significant that maybe it was an obvious question? Or if they were not significant, what would more sampling have changed that result somehow, or something like this? Okay, so that's your first paragraph. Your second paragraph, you really do go back out to your system. What does what you have discovered contribute to how we understand something about your system? And so if we go back to red-winged blackbirds and wetland systems, say that you have discovered something about the size of the harems in red-winged blackbirds dependent on something like the type of the wetland. So red-winged blackbirds are polygynous. The males will hold territories that multiple females can breed on, and there's some steep differences in how many females can be supported in different territories depending on where they are. So you find something new that enlightens our understanding of that in wetlands. Okay, so you're placing that into the context of how do we understand these wetland systems and the creatures that inhabit them. So you go back out to your system. This also might be where you say, oh, well, we discovered something kind of new and unexpected in this study that wasn't part of the hypothesis. Often that belongs in this part. And then third is your big picture. So that you found something new about your system. Well, something about that system might influence how we understand this big picture. The big picture is often searching for these unifying themes that have broad application. And if you found something new about your system, something about that system may influence those larger rules. How do we understand sexual selection in the context of this changing environment or something like this? And so again, it's not restating your introduction. It's really, truly continually taking what you did and putting it back into that context of the bigger picture. So outside of that general formula, you do have some other things in the scientific report. One is acknowledgments. So there's an acknowledgement section. And you basically, the goal of an acknowledgement section is to remember how the study was made possible. And so often, and it used to be actually more common that scientific researchers and authors would look to be the sole authors on their paper, and they might not have a ton of acknowledgments, but increasingly people are respecting that that research projects do not happen in a vacuum. To do a research project, you need access to gear, you need access to the sites. Whether you assume that it's your site or not, you may need permission to be on those sites. You may have already been granted to be on those sites. You may need funding and support in some way or other. You may have sought advice from somebody that provided you advice. You might have gotten help with species identification. There are a variety of ways you may acknowledge the ability of you to complete the study. So you try to think of anybody that could be acknowledged for that study. And in general, you don't acknowledge co-authors, but you acknowledge people that aren't serving as a co-author on a paper. And then you have literature cited. And that is where you include all the citations that you do in text. And so, especially in your introduction section and your discussion section, you can expect to be citing peer-reviewed literature quite a bit because you're making a case for your study from the peer-reviewed literature. And so anything that appears in your paper will appear in the literature cited section. For the purposes of most projects, we tend to recommend Northwest Science or APA formatting. And so making sure you're being consistent with your formatting is important, and it's actually more important than the specific type of formatting. But depending on the project you're doing, you'll be given specific guidance on what kind of citation formatting you can use. Okay, so the abstract. A lot of people tend to start off by writing their abstract, but if you write your paper first, it sometimes can make the abstract more interpretable. And so I've talked about these 3 by 3 by 3 by 3 paragraph pieces of writing. And it's important, or it's really useful as you start each one of these paragraphs off is to start it off with a topic sentence. Topic sentence is the sentence that states the primary piece of information or finding that the rest of the paragraph will then support and back up. If every paragraph starts with a topic sentence, what you can do is take the first sentence from each paragraph in the paper, copy and paste it into your abstract. And in the course of doing that, what you've done is you provided a very brief introduction, enough description of your methods and your results, and you're placing it back into context to give the reader the full range of what you need to know in an abstract, because abstracts have to provide all that information in a short number of words. And so if you paste in all your topic sentences, you're pretty well on your way. After that, you read through the abstract and you do some minor word correction to make the abstract read more smoothly. And so that's a nice trick. And it keeps you writing in a very clear and concise way if you use this approach of using topic sentences. So those are some of my recommendations for writing a scientific report and a draft of a scientific paper.